You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I've been in the tech startup investment ecosystem pretty much all my career since university, initially starting out in European tech investment and kind of enterprise education for entrepreneurs. And Ventures 54 is really focused on helping to build bridges that make those opportunities for importing and exporting out of the continent as easy as possible. So for us, it's about looking at every one of the stakeholders, really understanding their problems that they've identified themselves and the resources they need, and trying to connect them with the right people.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Anthony William Catt, who is the founder and director of Ventures 54, a company on a mission to build and strengthen the international investment corridors between Africa's tech, startup, and investor ecosystems and the rest of the world. Welcome to the podcast, Anthony. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. It's been a long time coming to have this conversation, but I'm really glad to be here today, so thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's been about 12 months.
Yeah.
But we're here.
We're here finally. Great to be.
Brilliant. So you've listened to the podcast before, so I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Anthony William Catt.
Yeah, and thank you again for having me in the podcast. Fantastic. So well done for all the work you're doing to share stories and put spotlights on the opportunities in Africa. My name, as said, is Anthony William Catt. I'm UK born, but very much feel African in the nature of the work I do and the places I live and work. I've been in the tech startup and investment ecosystem pretty much all my career since university, so the best part of a decade. Initially starting out in European tech and investment accelerators, corporate innovation, and kind of enterprise education for entrepreneurs, which is really the first half of my career, UK, European focused. And then the second half of my career, more of an international flavor, working across Africa from my first trip in 2015 to Sudan to Southeast Asia, working with venture capital funds there, looking to deploy capital at kind of Series A, Series B level into Europe. And then really where it all kind of came together, this entrepreneurial training experience, investment experience, and kind of exposure to emerging markets in Africa was when I joined Google for Startups as an investor in residence and was focused on how we got European investors to look at opportunities in the African continent, bringing out a series of them to Nigeria in 2019 to meet with companies across Africa. And since then, it's really led to this kind of journey to where I am now with my company Ventures 54, as you kind of described in the introduction, which is really focused around mobilizing international capital and resources from around the world into ecosystems for technology startups in Africa. And alongside that, building out the London Africa Network, which is a community of founders, investors, corporate government leaders operating between the UK and Africa, trying to strengthen bridges for its ecosystems around technology startups.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Anthony. So you're giving us great insights into your personal and professional life and your journey in the world of tech, which has led you to founding Ventures 54. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about Ventures 54 in terms of what its mission is in terms of strengthening international investment corridors between Africa tech ecosystems and the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's quite a broad statement we have on the website. So it could mean a lot of things for different people. And it is kind of changing for us on a kind of a quarterly basis in terms of the focus. But really broadly, what it is all about is obviously we've seen over the last kind of particularly 5 years, in the last decade, a huge growth and boom in the technology startup ecosystems across Africa, particularly in what are seen as the big four markets of Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, and several other emerging markets as well across the continent. And with that's come a lot of international interest for supporting the growth of those ecosystems, both from the perspective of putting resources overseas into those different markets, but also supporting talent and investment opportunities that want to expand beyond the borders within Africa into Europe, into North America and other such markets. And Venture 54 is really focused on helping to build bridges that make those opportunities for importing and exporting out of the continent as easy as possible. And this is really focused around venture capital investing, so early stage investing into technology startups. And we work with both sides of the table. We work with international investors from around the world who are looking to better understand, navigate, and access opportunities for investing on the continent. And on the other side of the coin, we work with local investors in Africa who are looking to mobilize capital to invest also themselves into the continent. And we do this through a series of interventions and support initiatives that build bridges and communities for these investors to connect with each other, to do research and reporting for them to better understand these markets, and also then working with the startups in these markets to provide them with capacity building support for fundraising so that we can help better connect with and receive investment from these investors, whether local or international.
So you touched on the interest and the opportunities of growing the African tech ecosystem, but how did you personally become interested in building bridges between the UK and African tech startup ecosystem?
Yeah, the journey wasn't a planned one. My first exposure to the African continent in any shape or form wasn't until about halfway through my career to date since leaving university. And back in 2015, I had the opportunity to go as a volunteer as part of a government delegation to Sudan. At the time, someone suggested I'd go, and I was really curious to explore a market that I had no idea about. And also in the junior stages of my career, keen to get opportunities to connect and learn with people. So kind of went out to Sudan with no real idea or understanding perception of the market, or indeed the African market. And out there, had the opportunity to engage with the British Council, an arm of the British government that were doing various projects and capacity building in Sudan, and had the opportunity to support Mashroy, which is their national entrepreneurship program. Imagine somewhere across between The Apprentice meets The Dragon's Den.
Oh, wow.
Entrepreneurs leave training, go on national TV, this really big kind of show, but really focused around putting a spotlight on entrepreneurs within Sudan. Off the back of being there, I remember sitting down at the end of this week. I was there with the people who were running the program, and I said, look, I don't have real context or understanding for the local challenges in Sudan. I've only been here a week. But looking at your program design based on what we do in the UK in terms of accelerators and incubators, these are the things I would tweak around your design in terms of the order of certain things you do with the entrepreneurs to support them. Anyway, gave them that feedback and I left thinking that would be that. And I got a call about 2 weeks later saying, could you come back next year and help us run this? We'd love you to kind of curate and coordinate the programming, and we'll do the local contextualization. So what was a volunteering opportunity the next year came to taking some of my holiday time from work to go out there and do this. The knock-on effect of that was the team in Sudan were like, you need to meet our team in Nigeria, you need to meet our team in Kenya. And slowly I was doing these kind of like side pieces supporting these initiatives, where it got to the point where actually I was really excited by starting to understand these kind of undertapped opportunities across the continent and these underserved markets. And actually, although I didn't have that local knowledge, there were resources that I had, best practice I had, that in collaboration with people on the ground could actually build better programs and ultimately drive quicker, scalable outcomes. And that was really the start of my journey. And then over the course of the next kind of 5-6 years, it's led to the last 18 months doing my work at Venture 54. I started to see the investment ecosystem grow on the continent. And while I was with Google for Startups, working on helping investors look at opportunities in Africa, which stemmed from my experience helping Asian funds access opportunities to invest in Europe. And I was really like, how can I combine this experience of bringing investors into new markets with my passion and excitement for helping develop entrepreneurial infrastructure and ecosystems in Africa? And that's where really the GFS Google for Startups piece came in. They gave me the opportunity to do this. And that's kind of led to where I'm now with Venture 54. But just before we kind of got to Venture 54, whilst in London, realizing that actually I really am excited by the opportunities to work within these African ecosystems and help build those bridges between resources and opportunities that can be localized in market. I wanted to build more relationships with people in the UK, and that's really where the London Africa Network came from. Back in 2021, COVID was all kind of, still in the midst of it. I was really keen to connect with people in London that were in that UK Africa Tech Corridor. A couple of us started to put some money behind the bar, do a bit of a Christmas dinner and drinks. About 20, 30 people came off the back of that. The feedback was like, hey, could we do one of these meetups every quarter? And that grew into what is now the London Africa Network, and that was 100 plus people. And that, of course, then led to having that network, having that experience on the continent, building Venture 54 as a formal vehicle to start helping build those bridges, particularly for mobilizing capital.
Fantastic. So you mentioned there your journey, which involved the opportunity of going to Sudan to provide assistance. So if we look at assistance, specifically technical assistance, could you talk us through the role of technical assistance funding in the African startup ecosystem and the work that you do with regards to that via Ventures 54?
Yeah, so for those who might be listening who aren't familiar with what technical assistance is, so technical assistance funding in the context of development finance institutions, so DFIs, which are institutions often deploying capital into international development projects. Technical assistance funding refers to the provision of non-financial support, so non-investment such as equity grants or loans generally. And these resources are there to kind of enhance the effectiveness, sustainability, and impact of development projects or initiatives in developing countries. So that might be capacity building and training for entrepreneurs, market access and networking, community building and strengthening of existing institutions, delivering that support, informing and supporting policy and regulation, and right through to kind of monitoring and evaluating these projects and doing research into markets. Usually you don't find the investment side that I mentioned there, but some DFIs do provide that kind of investment, direct equity grant investment as well. So it's not just non-financial support. Sometimes it is, but generally it's around non-financial support for ecosystem growth. So
you detailed the link between technical assistance funding and the work that you're currently doing with governments, DFIs, and funding agencies. Would it be possible to share some examples of, say, successful collaborations that have led to impactful outcomes via these channels?
Yeah, of course. So within the context of Ventures 54, when it comes to technical assistance funding, traditionally it's targeted towards supporting the entrepreneurs and the founders with skills, capacity building communities and ecosystems. And within Venture 54, although we do that, what we try to do is really angle ourselves towards technical assistance for investors, particularly those investors on the ground in these various markets. And so how we go about doing that is saying, well, if an investor's role is predominantly two things, right? Mobilize capital into their fund that they can deploy and then source high quality startups that they can invest in and support. How do we provide technical assistance that enables them to do that more easily and more frictionless? And obviously in developing markets, there is a lot more work to be done on the ground to build those markets. So we really see that investors in Africa are market makers. They're not just mobilizing capital, deploying that capital in startups. They're also having to build the infrastructure to create the startups. And so for us, when we think about technical assistance, we want to support founders, but we also equally want to make sure we're supporting investors to make their lives as easy as possible. So a kind of a good example from our perspective is probably one of our latest initiatives we've been working called Founder to Funder. And this is an initiative that is very clearly about building bridges between UK investor communities and local investor and startup communities in Africa. And we piloted that earlier this year in South Africa. And the focus there was how do we help UK investors that are either currently investing in South Africa increase their capacity to do so, or those who've not yet invested in Africa to help them understand the market, build relationships and connections to hopefully get them to the point where they can start confidently investing in the market. But then conversely, working with local investors in South Africa who want to access opportunities for potentially raising funds from the UK for their own funds, or to just build better relationships with the UK markets, particularly where they might want to, say, have one of their local South African portfolio companies expand into the UK, whether that be for fundraising or kind of market business growth. And as a part of that in between is really working with high quality, high growth tech startups in South Africa that are looking to raise internationally or access opportunities to enter new markets internationally, that we can use as a way to bring those investors together from the UK and South Africa to look at deal opportunities, to learn and connect with each other. So creating awareness of one another, helping them to understand the markets and the entry points and the access, and making sure the founders have the right tools and capacities for fundraising successfully internationally and can tap into other resources and opportunities in the UK beyond investment.
Brilliant. So you've kind of detailed the work that you're doing with startups, governments, DFIs via Ventures 54 and also the London African Network. So it's quite clear that you have a diverse background and experience. So how would you go about integrating these areas to drive collaboration and opportunities for entrepreneurship in Africa?
So I was having this conversation actually with somebody the other day around what is the kind of fundamentals right now that are making the biggest difference in terms of developing the market, or as you said there, how do you create opportunities around collaboration? And one word that always comes to mind is awareness.
Yes.
Actually, firstly, if you look at Africa, right, it's 54 countries. In each country, there are regions and there are so many different ecosystems, and there are a lot of new people entering this space. Often, a lot of people just aren't aware of who is who. So who are the investors who are running checks into Africa? Who are the entrepreneurial support organizations that are sourcing and helping train founders? Who are the DFIs, the government agencies? And so what we've really found right now, one of the fundamentals is just creating awareness of who is who, helping people to qualify and unqualify those that they should be engaging with and where they can get that support and resources. At this stage right now, we see a lot of people doing a lot of the same things, which is great, but often there are opportunities where actually if you collaborate, you can create complementary opportunities and kind of get more for the resource that's going on. So for us, it's really about looking at every one of the stakeholders that we work with, whether that's government, investors, founders, really understanding what it is their problems they've identified themselves and the resources they need, and trying to connect them with the right people to try and remove the challenges where you go and connect with a lot of people, have a lot of conversations with so many people in the space and you're not sure of who is who, and ultimately find that the people you're speaking with aren't the right ones. So making sure everyone's aware of who is who. And that's why when, for example, it be Venture 54 or the London Africa Network, we do a lot of convening of these people to bring them into digital or physical rooms, but putting them in the room saying, this is why we're in the room. These are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And we believe you're the right people to do it together. We can't tell you how to do that. And we aren't the right people to even kind of guide you on that. But when you guys come together, you're going to be the ones who do create those solutions, those strategies, and will drive those outcomes. And actually, that's right now a really crucial role great organizations that we're seeing in the ecosystem are doing, is putting all those people in the room and creating that awareness.
Fantastic. So you touched on a key point, which is awareness and understanding who is who. So as someone who knows the who's in terms of the African startups and investors, what are some of the common trends that you've noticed amongst investors who are looking to invest in the African tech space?
I mean, this will vary from every investor to investor, right? So I don't dare to speak on behalf of our community. So, don't fully quote me on this, although this, of course, isn't a podcast, so it really is. But I think actually maybe there are two sides to this coin. There is what are the industries and sectors that are being looked at in terms of broad investment opportunities, and then also what are the current trends around transacting those investments, particularly in the downturn that we've seen ourselves in the last kind of 18 months. So when it comes to African tech investing, fintech is the one that I'm sure has come up countless times on the podcast, alongside infrastructure, energy, education, climate, health, logistics, and e-commerce, right? Some of these big, clear, defined industries. Now, mentioned fintech there is often the one that's most regularly spoken about, particularly between the UK and London being a financial hub and the African continent. But actually, in 2022, we saw a reduction in investing going into fintech. It was down by about 30% on the previous year. And equally with health, another big industry, was down by a similar amount percentage, if not more. Whereas we saw in climate and e-commerce 200+% growth in investing. And so these are some of the industries that are getting a lot of eyeballs right now. E-commerce, obviously, because now we're seeing more digital internet infrastructure coming across the continent, which is creating a whole new wave of digital and online consumers. Climate, obviously, within the African continent for various reasons, is a huge industry right now, but also not just a huge industry for solving climate issues being suffered across the African continent, actually creating the innovations and solutions for issues we're seeing in other parts of the world. And actually, if you look 10, 15 years down the line, African innovation in clean tech and climate tech could be at the forefront of innovation for this. And that talks about then markets out of Africa that are the best practice globally, which is really interesting and exciting. Then the other side of the coin, I think, should be spoken about is right now in the downturn that we've seen. And obviously, venture capital investing on the continent is very small comparatively to the rest of the world. And although we had seen a reduction in the first half this year to previous years, it's actually been still pretty good as comparative to the rest of the world. So yes, any shrinkage we've seen investing on the continent here is just an effect of the global shrinkage we've seen and not Africa as an outlier. But I think what we're seeing is a shift away from growth at all cost investing to performance, runway and profit with more modest expectations on what that growth will look like for these startups. This has meant lower and arguably more realistic valuations of companies are starting to come in. And also, as well, a diversification in the type of investments being made. So we've traditionally had a lot of equity investing, but now we're seeing a lot of debt investing coming in as well, and blended finance approaches for founders. That's not just being driven by a reduction in money in the markets from an equity standpoint, but also investors are realizing for kind of longevity for their portfolio companies, but also for their funds themselves, particularly those who may be raising capital for their funds at the moment in the downturn. Having that blended approach can somewhat de-risk the investment, but also bring more capital into the market as well. So I think they're kind of the trends in how investments are happening, but also where the investments are going.
Awesome. So keeping on the theme of trends, we are seeing an emerging trend of African startups who are, I'd say, exploring the UK market as a springboard for global exposure and growth. Is this a viable strategy, and how can the UK serve as a springboard for African entrepreneurs?
I say this without sounding, as a British guy, being biased, but obviously having had my background experience being in the UK, I'm naturally better versed with talking about the positives and pros of being here. But I think the first thing to say there is companies wanting global exposure and growth within Africa is one thing, but actually a lot of African-born companies are from day one, or certainly in their early stages, looking to some extent offshore their businesses. And this is not just to the UK, this is also to the US. And the reason often being is because of access to capital. So right now, if you look at a lot of companies, I believe if you look at Nigeria, about 2/3 of all companies that receive venture capital funding have offshore entities where they've often received that capital. And the reason being is a lot of investors right now don't have the ability to invest into companies that are structured and based in certain markets across Africa, whether that be that their fund mandate doesn't allow them to do it, whether it be that it's too high risk in terms of exchange controls, risk in market, currency fluctuations, where they actually need these startups to be, registering in Delaware or London. So even before we get to the point of the idea of growing internationally in access markets, a lot of them are setting up from day one so they can bring in capital to the business. And from a growth standpoint, and capital is a part of that. One of the strengths, I think, for the United Kingdom, obviously, key things are geographic distance to the continent. It's a short kind of 6-hour flight to Nigeria from London. Time zone difference is only a couple of hours, depending on where you are on the continent. Languages, English is a largely predominantly spoken language in most of the established markets. And the diaspora, obviously, as well, is very strong in the United Kingdom. So there's some key ones. But if you look at the United Kingdom as a startup ecosystem, we're also talking here about entrepreneurs growing and wanting global exposure. There's a wealth of accelerators and infrastructure, right from academic to private, that are supporting entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of free support and training and resourcing. Setting up in the UK a business is very, very easy. And not just that, there are a lot of support entities that provide soft landing. For example, the Global Entrepreneurs Programme from the Department of International Trade helps high growth technology startups who want to land and expand the UK and provide you free resource around setting up your business, legal, accounting, advisory, access to markets, access to resources, and experts. And so there's a series of initiatives that do that in the public and private sector, not to mention the Tech Nations visa scheme and the digital talent visas that are on hand to help entrepreneurs internationally come into the UK. And I believe the Tech Nation program is now going to be run by Founders Forum. So if you're searching it, it might not come up as Tech Nation anymore. And then things from around investment. So famously, the SCIS, EIS investment schemes, and these were tax relief schemes for early stage investors for investing to kind of promote and champion them doing early stage investing into entrepreneurs. These have been hugely successful, and others have looked in international markets to do the same. Although Brexit aside, we are a stone's throw from Europe, which kind of is that springboard to allow you easy access and transit into those markets. And then finally, there's a hugely growing UK-Africa ecosystem here. I mean, the London Africa Network that I'm a part of is an example of that, but there is so many people now who are operating in the UK and Africa. So actually, when entrepreneurs come here, yes, I can point them in the direction of these formal programs, but half the time I'm just making a dozen introductions to individuals like yourself, other founders that have been there and done it, who can then give their lived experience and give them another 10 introductions as well. So there's a huge flourishing UK-Africa ecosystem of people based here in London and across the country as well that are on hand to support beyond these formally signposted institutions.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that information. So I guess if we look at it from the other direction, what advice would you give to UK companies interested in tapping into African markets for opportunities and talent?
Yeah, this is a really growing area at the moment, right? We talk about founders exporting themselves and their businesses off the continent into markets like the UK or the US, but actually there is this hugely undertapped opportunity to do the same way, whether it's taking your business into those markets or actually, say, talent. So what we've found at the moment is when we're not personally doing too much work in this ourselves, so it's more observational for me right now than kind of lived experience, but we are seeing a lot of scaling ventures in Europe looking to access markets across the continent and set up operations. I think firstly, a demonstration that is there's a number of actual formal programs supporting that. You have, for example, Partech, one of the biggest VCs in Europe and biggest VCs on the African continent, have got their Chapter 54 European Scale-Up program. So open scaling ventures in Europe to land expand to African markets. Initiative funded by the European Union called Enrich in Africa alongside Co-Creation Hub, which is kind of one of the most prominent startup hubs on the continent out of a couple of different markets. They're running a program that's helping African founders expand to Europe, but I believe also European founders to scale into Africa. So you've got a series of these programs actually providing a kind of end-to-end solution for that. So I recommend people looking at doing that. And then finally as well, I think looking actually, if you're wanting to do it, another first port of call is if we look at London, for example, they have London and Partners, which is a kind of the business side of the Mayor of London's office, which does a lot of work with entrepreneurs, whether it's UK entrepreneurs want to expand into markets internationally or entrepreneurs want to expand into the UK. They do a ton of support. If you look, for example, in South Africa, Cape Town, where I was based the first half this year, for the Western Cape, so the whole kind of western region of South Africa, there's an entity called Westgrow, which is very much a similar London Partners there to promote, champion tourism and business and investment into the Western Cape. And they provide a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs to expand, access kind of human talent and capital as well within those markets. So I think for any entrepreneurs looking to expand into a market, assuming you've already got an understanding for which region of Africa you want to look at, is to then actually, okay, are there any institutions providing programs that can support us to do that? Or locally, are there public private sector organizations like a Westgrow in South Africa, like a London Partners in London, who will probably have either initiatives running or individuals that can help you? And I think that is the first stepping off point, I would say, if you don't already have context on the ground. But I think above and beyond that is if you're going to do anything around that, you really need to get on the ground to live and breathe the market that you want to work within, or even to hire talent from, right? It's not just about saying that there is a customer base that mirrors our market here in our home country. You've actually got to really understand the local context. You've got to understand that business is very different in different parts of Africa, and also equally as well, if you're going to engage high local talent, you want to be on the ground there with them to really make sure they understand your business. For me, with Venture 54, when we were expanding South Africa, a big part of me moving down there was when bringing on talent into the business or working with local partners was living and breathing how they work and how they operate, and understanding that we need to fit within that and complement that, rather than just assume people can work within our frameworks or our ways of operating as well. So use one of these formal institutions that's offering support and resources, and then making sure that you're getting on the ground, even for a short period of time, to make sure you bring on the right first couple hires or people to lead things for you within those local markets.
Awesome advice. So if we look closer at talent and unlocking human resources, how do you go about connecting, say, startups with the right expertise to ensure their success?
Yeah, I think the one thing I come back to on this, again, I'm only speaking of my experience, right?
Yes.
And it's building trusted relationships with people. You can have a network where a lot of people that you've met. And you might even have alignment on what you do or the areas you work in. But to have a trusted relationship is something that you have to build over time. And that comes from, firstly, is really understanding the people that you're working with inside out, both personally and professionally. But also, time to work together is where you build the trust through the action of doing things and showing that you can do things. It's great to meet someone one time and provide them an introduction, which is valuable. But it's far stronger and deeper when you continuously provide that kind of value, because you really show that you've gotten to know and get to understand them. So for us, when it comes to kind of unlocking that human and commercial resources, for those who work, whether it's a founder or an investor, we really take the time to build long-term relationships. So it's very much a case of going out there, meeting as many people as possible across the ecosystem from these stakeholder groups and understanding people. But to make sure that whoever we're going to work with, we're doing so because we're aligned, both in terms of what the value exchange is, that we can provide that value to them, and they've got the ability to work with us to unlock that value, but also to make sure we know what we are and what we are not, and they know that clearly as well. So to say what we can and can't do. And I think there's that kind of expectation management piece. And when you're in a space like the space we're working with, hey, we can unlock opportunities in new markets, or we can introduce as, hey, Anthony and Venture 54 are a really good organization to talk to about accessing opportunities in the UK. That's quite a broad statement. And so what we always want to make sure we do is that people know clearly what we can provide and can't provide, and we know clearly what they actually need. Because 9 out of 10 times we might not be the right people to do it, but we can then introduce them to those that might be able to do it. And that means in that process, you kind of almost need to kind of, whenever we provide our programs or our initiatives, kind of cut the fluff. We get straight to the nuts and bolts of what needs to be done. So a very unprogrammatic approach. What are your specific challenges and what are you trying to access? And then taking a long-term relationship approach where we unlock those things and making sure they know, look, this isn't going to be a quick 1 week quick fire thing. We're going to work with you long-term, and we're going to kind of on an ad hoc basis make sure we provide you as much value as possible. And so I think that's the approach that needs to be taken right now, because markets are shifting and changing so dramatically in terms of what entrepreneurs on the continent, different markets need versus what resources are available in the UK. Obviously, we had the downturn, which has seen a decrease in investment capital coming to markets, but also that has a massive effect on the DFIs, government agencies, and their funding and what they can do. And suddenly it shifts the amount of resources that can be thrown behind certain programs, initiatives. So that means having a short-term approach could mean that you could severely damage your ability to support entrepreneurs, because sometimes you have those kind of dips in resources and access to market opportunities. Whereas if you take it as a long-term approach, it means, yes, you'll have those dips, but you'll also have those rises again. And so very much that long-term trusted relationship approach is the way we do it.
As you mentioned, building a network and trust takes time, and it also comes with its own challenges. I was wondering if you could share examples of some of the challenges you've encountered while working on cross-border investment initiatives.
I think the biggest challenge I've seen or observed where I've not been directly involved is often a consequence of not having done proper research. So if I take the example of where I've seen international investors looking at opportunities in various markets across the continent, and they're going through the due diligence process. And we get to this point of term sheets negotiations, and you see a massive misalignment in expectations, whether it be around valuation, the vehicle in which the investment will be made. And more often than not, these come from research basis. So understanding how that fund makes its investments. So the founders understanding, well, this is how that fund is structured. This is how they operate and do their investments. To investors having expectations around what a valuation might be, say, because they're traditionally a European investor and they have not a bias towards maybe European market valuations, but they've yet to fully understand the nature or reality of those local markets, and vice versa for those founders having expectations of their valuation in that local market versus what it might be for that international investor in their local market. And also we've seen conflict between local and international investors around valuations as well. So it's not just a founder to invest in, it could be an investor piece. We found that actually, and this is where we try to play a role, is kind of expectation management. So making sure there is an alignment on these things and that they understand the end-to-end process for both sides of the table. But equally as well, to quickly unvalidate or validate whether or not there is going to be incompatibility for these various reasons, and making sure that upfront that research is done and those things are known means either people can adapt and find a way to get there, or if it just won't work, you kind of go your separate ways. And this is a great point talking to this is we have a lot of founders in South Africa where it's a very hard market to invest directly into an international investor. You have very tight exchange controls about getting money in and out of the country. There's IP regulations and restrictions around how you can get IP out of the country if you want to expand the company internationally or offshore it. And so one of the things when working with founders in South Africa is you might be a South African market serving company and you want to keep that entire business in South Africa. But if you are maybe looking to access international capital or you want to expand the business internationally and take the IP overseas, it's worth, when you set up early doors, getting another entity set up overseas straight away. So when you come to the point of, say, fundraising, instead of getting to the point of negotiating, say, well, we can't invest into your South African vehicle, we need you to set up offshore. You might not have enough time to set up offshore before the deal dies or the investors, no longer want to participate. So by thinking about those things up front, it enables to make sure you're not closing any doors and you have that optionality. But also for founders as well, if they're thinking long-term about growth internationally, they're probably going to want an entity overseas. So where do they want to be based? Do they want to be based in the US because that's the market they want to go into? Or the UK because they want proximity to country? So getting people to think about these things ahead of time before they go down that investment journey is really, really important so you don't hit these speed bumps later on.
Fantastic. So earlier you mentioned working with people and taking a long-term view. You also touched on valuations and funds. Recently, you've started working with some hedge funds with a long-term view.
Yeah, alternate asset classes to venture capital. So private equity, hedge funds, pension funds who are looking at opportunities long-term within Africa. So yeah, we're not doing any formal investment projects, but we're working with them to kind of create a spotlight on the opportunities and connect them into the ecosystem.
Fantastic. So how do you see this approach shaping the investment landscape for African startups and tech companies?
I wish you were asking me this question maybe like January next year, but it's an exciting place to be. So working alongside venture capital funds, investing in African startups, it's obviously a completely different asset class to private equity, to pension funds, hedge funds, both in terms of stage of investing, but also the vehicles and the type of investing they do and the expectations of when you get liquidity events and how you get your returns out of the investments. So they're completely different worlds in that perspective. And one of the things that we've been doing, and this is working in collaboration with the British government, is starting to get these asset managers around tables together. So back to the point I said before, creating awareness of who is who. So can we get some of the leading venture capital fund managers to sit around the table with these later stage asset managers to talk about the opportunities for investing across the African continent and what might it look like for these later stage asset managers to deploy capital to say into some of these venture capital funds. And the two parts there, right, are firstly validating the market opportunity. Is there a clear opportunity where these investors could see a return if they start investing in this space? And equally, comes back to everything is kind of that risk factor. And actually, how do you understand what the risk is? How do you hedge that risk? And is it ultimately a viable place to operate right now for them as a fund? For a lot of them right now, it's a more of a long-term piece. To predominantly understand the market, the return opportunities are there and are growing, but it's understanding actually what are the vehicles in which we can invest. Because right now, for a lot of them, to deploy capital from their asset class into venture capital is difficult in terms of how funds are structured, but how the value is realized in the returns. I think what will happen is we will see these later stage asset classes doing more investing, whether it's putting it into venture or investing in their own respective classes, but more in the continent. We'll start to see clearer pathways to getting cash out. So right now, that's one of the biggest restrictions is how you can put cash in, but how you get cash out at liquidity events and returns, whether that be, say, you have to have the businesses set up in the UK or the US, or wherever it be. It will force the markets to mature and to find ways in which we can more clearly get the cash out, because that's one of the biggest risk factors is actually the cash gets locked up and how do we realize that value at the point of an exit, IPO, whatever it might be. The second thing will be probably more around transparency and knowledge sharing of market activities. These later stage funds, are kind of more around analyzing markets in a public sense, particularly the publicly traded funds. So we'll see a lot of more surfacing of data. I mean, right now, the knowledge infrastructure for the African tech ecosystem is still in its infancy, but we're seeing great organizations like Brighter, who are building a platform for developing market knowledge and investing. And, you've got reports that come out from Partech and others every year that put a highlight on what's going on the continent. So we'll see a lot more data being accessible. But really right now, the role we're trying to play is that early stage, create awareness of who is who, get these venture capital funds to present about the opportunities they see and how they're operating and the success and the stories they're having that come out of it. And then seeing how these other asset managers respond to it. What are the questions they're asking? What are the points in which we say, what gets you to a yes to deploy X amount of capital as an LP into a VC fund? Or if you're not doing that, how would you want to deploy your capital? Because that's when we start to think about what are the vehicles that can be created to kind of mobilize more of this capital and bring it into the markets.
Fantastic. So I guess this is all part of your strategy for mobilizing more capital into Africa. How do you plan to scale these efforts in the coming years?
Good question. And a conversation me and my team and my advisor are having all the time.
Brilliant.
So I'm on here for a year from now. It's probably going to be a completely different answer, or probably in 3 months' time, to be honest. But for us right now, what scaling looks like, it's not necessarily about scaling our capacities in terms of headcount or resources, and we are a human-intensive business. It's really about deepening our knowledge and understanding of the markets in which we operate. So within the context of the UK, we've got really strong relationships into the public-private sector, the investor communities, particularly investor communities that are not currently investing into African markets. And they're the ones we really want to go after. And our growth is predominantly around how do we mobilize new capital into markets, not just get more of the same capital coming in. But the part for us over the next couple of years and the 5-year horizon is to make sure that we really understand the local markets within Africa that we operate. And that's being firstly on the ground, making sure that the people in our team are from those local markets and are able to contextualize the resource and opportunities that we can bring to the ground. And then I guess finally for us is, what does the future models of investing on the continent? Is it going to be more venture capital? Are there going to be new asset classes or investment vehicles? Are we going to see more deep and blended finance approaches, and making sure that we can either support mobilization of capital for those, or we potentially ourselves become one of those modes for investing, and we might be able to start deploying capital ourselves? I don't know yet the answer on that question, but right now we're really focused on making sure that working with the DFIs and government agencies we are working with, we're building initiatives that really listen to both the founder and investment communities around what they need to make it more frictionless for capital to come in and out of these markets, and what initiatives give them more capacity, time, resources to either raise as a founder and grow their business, or mobilize and deploy capital as an investor into those businesses.
Brilliant. So you've clearly detailed your plans for scaling as they are for now. You've slightly touched on this, but how are you going about balancing the various interests of the range of stakeholders that are involved in these efforts?
I think the key thing that we really try to do is make sure the proverbial table is representative of the whole ecosystem. and everybody has a different role to play. So whether it be founders, investors, government, or the kind of, let's categorize broadly here, entrepreneurial support organizations, so law firms, accountancies, accelerators, everybody that provides that hands-on support like a technical assistance initiative would. And it's really, for us, is understanding what's the end goal of all these different stakeholders and making sure that we work back from each of those end goals so that whatever we're providing to them creates that end goal value. So a great example was, I was on a panel with a series of investors earlier in the year, and the host asked the question, should governments be building their own investment funds to invest into startups? And it came up, the question was like, well, what is the government's end goal in international development and trade? Ultimately, it's to increase the wealth and prosperity of their home country. And that doesn't have to be in public money growing through investments, right? It's about private entities and businesses prospering, infrastructure being there. So it was saying, well, an international investor's role is to invest, but the government's role will be to create the environment in which those investments can be made more successfully, to create the tax and incentive schemes. So it's making sure that we understand what it is those organizations can also do and not just what they want, and bring them together to say, okay, well, if this is the challenge you will face, we're seeing here are the connecting dots. And then making sure when they're at the table, everyone knows that. And it goes back to that expectation management piece, that awareness piece, and having alignment on who does what, who doesn't do what, and what are people's end goals and objectives and outcomes. And if we can bring them to the table and create that awareness across those different areas, what will naturally then happen is positive conversations that will come to the solutions that work for everybody. Whereas if you try to work with any of these entities in kind of a siloed approach and manage that, you're going to start trying to generate ideas that you think will work, but it actually isn't informed by the collective. So our goal always is to make sure we get all these stakeholders on the table, make sure everyone understands what everyone's end outcome is and what resources they can bring to the table, and start that conversation for them to generate those ideas. And then we might take those ideas forward, or they will take those ideas based on what we've shown them, and that will inform their approach to working independent of us.
Brilliant. So you've mentioned the end goals and also the trends that you're seeing in mobilizing more capital into Africa. So keeping on the theme of trends, what are some of the trends that you're seeing in, say, the international investment corridors in Africa that you're currently excited about?
Gosh, there's quite a few things I'm excited about. There's what I'm personally excited about and what's also happening in the markets. I'll try and blend the two. So I think one of the things we're seeing that's quite exciting right now is, I said this near the beginning, right? You have the big four markets, you had Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa. But now we're really starting to see a lot of investments going into several other key countries across the continent. But even more excitingly, we're seeing investments going into markets that you might have been surprised to see getting venture capital investments. Sadly, obviously, we know since April, we've had the civil war and conflict happening in Sudan, which has kind of brought their ecosystem to somewhat of a grinding halt in terms of the progress it was making. But we had seen the first venture capital deals go into Sudan. We'd seen a startup make it into Y Combinator from Sudan. So we're now starting to see that actually entrepreneurs are popping up across most markets in Africa. And even those that have had historically some of the biggest challenges in terms of operating on the international stage and receiving investment, Sudan being one of them, is able to find innovative solutions to make that work, and that there are venture capital funds who are at the forefront, who are willing to go into these markets and start making those investments. So that's something that really excites me, that it's not just in these big markets we're seeing investments, we're seeing a lot of these smaller, more challenging markets, which means there are opportunities, but there are vehicles if people are willing to kind of explore them. I think the other thing for me is personally, but this is also looked at by a lot of investors as well, is where informal economies are being tapped into. So those traditionally that haven't been served digitally, and being able to create solutions that bring informal economies into the digital space, which can scale them up, which can mean these communities that are often not fully plugged into national infrastructure and ecosystems can start to access opportunities and improve the way in which they receive them. And then also we're now at a point where we're seeing a lot of, use the analogy that the PayPal mafia, those that came out of PayPal have gone on to build some of the biggest companies since then, with the returns they've made. And more often than not, it's not the founders, it's the first employees that came into the company. We're starting to see that now on the continent, or we're going to start to see a lot more of that, where you've got these people who were hired as first employees into these tech companies that have gone on to scale, raise funding, have had successful exits. And these first employees have been able to realize some of that cash value and are now taking that real world learned experience of building a business and applying it to opportunities and challenges they're seeing in the market, and are going to build a new business with all of that experience, which just means you've got these leveled up operators now building businesses. So I think the caliber and standard businesses is only going to increase because of that experience as well. So I'm at the moment mapping out different businesses, who are their leadership teams, who's had exits, where have those people gone, and seeing the opportunities they're going after. And because often that means they're going to be very effective people in executing on those opportunities.
Awesome. So moving from trends and looking to the future, where do you see cross-border investment between Africa and the rest of the world in the near future? What will it look like?
I think capital coming to markets is only going to grow. And I think we're going to see a lot more new investment in the space, which feels quite obvious to say as markets grow, but I think it's going to become more frictionless. So we talked earlier about companies having to kind of offshore from day one, setting up in Delaware or London to enable more capital securely and safely to flow into their businesses. But I'm really interested to think that actually, will we in the next kind of 5 years see the Delaware of London of Africa? Who is going to be that country or market that becomes the go-to place for investing? You know, we look at, yes, we talk about Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt of this world, but actually you could look at Rwanda, or even Mauritius, right? These small state countries that don't have these big startup ecosystems, but are making it incredibly business friendly to set up businesses, to have international holdings, to get capital in and out of them. So I'm hoping and excited that we may find the Delaware or London of Africa, which means a UK fund no longer has to say, well, we really need you to have operations and set up in London or the US. They say, actually, if you guys can have that operation for investing into if it were Rwanda, that will get me really excited. And I think we'll get there at some point. Hopefully, we'll get clearer to that site in the next 5 years or so. I think from an actual investing perspective, hopefully we will see more growth stage funds entering the space. If you look at some of the reporting and some of the data that's out right now on where investment capital is going into the ecosystem at the kind of early stage, from incubator, accelerator, first check, right through to seed, that's where the highest portion of money currently is being deployed in the ecosystem in terms of number of deals in the last couple of years. Whereas in Series A, B, C downwards, there's a lot less capital being deployed. One, that's a result of not being as many companies in that growth stage, but we're going to see more in that space. So I think we're going to see more growth stage funds coming into the market, but also existing funds who are probably earlier stage building growth funds as well to continue investing down that journey. So a more frictionless ways to invest, which may come through the Delaware or London of Africa, and we'll see more growth stage funding, hopefully, to help continue to scale up those successful businesses that are right now in that kind of pre-seed, seed stage.
That's great to hear. So if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself and Ventures 54 in the next 5 years or in the near future?
Yeah, again, it's that great question. And I can't say for certain what that looks like. As operating in the African tech ecosystem, things are changing constantly, particularly around what needs to be done. But as I said with the previous question about what we're doing, I think it's a more scaled version of what we're doing now in terms of our knowledge and understanding, and that might be growing our team. But I think it goes beyond not just creating connections and opportunities to mobilize capital for the contents tech ecosystem, but also potentially help create new vehicles and models to enable more money to flow in and out of Africa easily. For myself personally, very much going on a journey right now, being in South Africa first half this year, moving to Kenya for the back half this year before spending time next year in Nigeria. So it's very much exploring these markets and working out where we're best placed to provide support. And it goes back to that point before. We take a very collaborative approach to what we do, particularly in local markets. So we look for the local talent, expertise and organizations we can collaborate with. And our role should only ever be where we can do something that's unique, whether that's mobilizing capital that didn't previously exist or bringing in resources that can be plugged into existing initiatives on the ground and collaborate with local partners and human talent as well. So wherever we are in 5 years' time, it's hopefully in a very collaborative pool of great organizations and institutions across the continent that we're bringing resources, talent, opportunities to.
Awesome. And I look forward to seeing how that develops.
Me too, buddy. Me too.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
I do. And I also knew this question was coming, having listened to the podcast.
You came prepared.
I came prepared, but thankfully this is one that's held true to my heart, even if it comes from maybe an almost comical person. But it's a quote that actually I have all of my stuff from my flat in London is currently in storage because I'm traveling across the continent working there. So I don't have it in front of me, but it normally would be in my flat on my wall. But it was a quote from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air himself, with Will Smith. See, I'm not about to bust out the rhyme from the original show, but it's I'll read it out for you. It's, don't try to build a wall. You don't set out to build a wall. You don't say, I'm going to build the biggest, baddest, greatest wall that's ever been built. You don't start there. You say, I'm going to lay this brick as perfect as a brick can be laid. And you do that every single day, and soon you have a wall. And that quote I absolutely love because it's saying that you're going on a long journey, or it certainly feels for me it's a long journey. And if you look at what you want it to be, it can be quite daunting. And often the wall that you've got in your head now is not the wall you're going to end up finishing building. So we should just really focus on the day by day and making sure that everything we do is of the highest quality. So even if we change direction, even that design of the wall differs, we know that everything we've done till now has put us in the best possible position to take that next step forward. And I think working within the African tech and startup ecosystem, things are changing constantly. And so you just need to put your best foot forward every day and make sure you're offering the best value you possibly can. And that, you know, this is a long journey and that we're all in this together. And we just need great quality along the way.
Thank you for sharing that. Who knew the Fresh Prince was also a philosopher?
I know, right? He's holds close to my heart. Think about him every day.
Brilliant. As we've come to the end of today's conversation, do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing at Ventures 54?
Yeah, so for Ventures 54, if you're a DFI or a government institution that is looking to build various initiatives and bridge between the UK, Europe and Africa when it comes to early stage startups and venture capital, or indeed you're an investor internationally looking to access opportunities of the continent, or an investor on the continent looking to unlock resources in the UK, please do get in touch. We're always happy to have conversations, and if we're not the right people to support or work with, we'll point in the right direction of who would be. And then also, if you don't mind, I'd love to do a shout out for the London Africa Network. For those who are operating between the UK and Africa, or are starting to get into that space, whether you're an African founder looking to come to the UK to explore the market, or you're someone in the UK who's starting to think about working in that kind of Africa tech space, go to www.londonafrica.org. We're a community to bring people together. We have a convening every quarter in London, and we would love to kind of welcome you into the community so you can learn, connect. And then finally, you can follow me on LinkedIn. I write a weekly news post about what's going on in African tech, which seems to be a newsletter as well. But also it's a great way to just connect with me on a personal note for any of the things that I do. And then finally, I should say as well, Chester, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. Really love the work you're doing, as I said before, to put a spotlight on what's going on, and look forward to future episodes, even if it's mine.
Fantastic. The feeling's mutual. Really respect the work that you're doing, and it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. So thank you for joining us today. It's clear that your passion for building bridges between Africa's tech ecosystem and the rest of the world is making an impact and creating positive change. So brilliant, and kudos to you and the team.
Thank you, my friend. It's been a pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.